Okay, and welcome back. So now we have so far covered technology shocks, we have covered labor supply shocks. The next shock that we're going to look at is a government spending shock. Right, now in a government spending shock, right, the first two shocks that we looked at were supply side shocks. Technology shocks and labor supply shocks are supply side shocks. Why? Because they originate on the supply side of the economy. Ain't a boo-boo. It's always good to mark all of your equilibrium points before you change the equilibrium. It's generally a good idea. So, my bad. Anyways, this government spending shock I'll say we're technology and labor supply shocks. Or supply side shocks. Government spending shock. And a demand side shock, meaning it's going to originate in the demand side of the economy. So we're not going to be touching the aggregate supply curve in this case. We're going to be actually just touching the aggregate demand curve. We hope it doesn't press charges. So when we do this, right, we need to ask ourselves first, where is it going to originate? What function, what curve is a government spending shock going to originate in? Well, what I'll say is a government spending shock originates within the IS curve. If G sub t increases, the IS curve shifts to the right. So let's have the IS curve shift out to the right. IS prime or something. All right, well, the IS curve shifts out to the right. The real interest rate is going to increase. Why is the real interest rate going to increase if the IS curve shifts to the right? Well, if the IS curve shifts to the right, recall GDP is Y equals C plus I plus G. Now, if government spending goes up, right, the cost of borrowing is going to increase. Why is that? Well, let's assume for a second this is a debt finance government spending shock. Why would we assume that? Well, it's just coming out of the blue. They're spending a lot. Chances are it's not like they had that just sitting kind of like, just off to the side, nice little reserves, kind of like, Keynes would have said would have been a good idea. It's probably going to be financed through purchasing or selling new bonds. Therefore, the public purchases those bonds, right? If the public purchases those bonds, right? Think about this in terms of just loanable funds, funds that are available that can be loaned out by financial institutions. If there is a shock that decreases loanable funds, the cost of borrowing is going to increase. So if the cost of borrowing increases, well, the real interest rate is going to go up because there are fewer loanable funds. If the supply of loanable funds drops, the cost of borrowing, of loaning those funds being loaned out to you, that cost is going to increase. So the price of that will go up. Therefore, there's an increase in the interest rate, which means investment's going to fall, and this leads to something that's known as crowding out. An increase in government spending is going to crowd out private investment. And this is really where the monetary policy stuff comes into play. And we'll get a look at how it comes into play in just a moment. But that IS curve shifts out, and what we do is we trace a little dotted line down to exactly the level, the price level, that the market is currently experiencing in equilibrium. Why do we trace it down to that price level? Well, we trace it down to that price level because this is the amount of output that people would like to get at this price. Where did that come from? Well, when the aggregate demand curve shifts out, like this, right, that aggregate demand curve is going to shift out. I'll call this YTH for hopeful. Right? That's the amount of output that people would like to get at this price level along this demand curve. But now the question is that the amount of output that people are going to actually get at that price level along that demand curve? Namely meaning, is that where supply and demand intersect? Well, the answer is no. So we would like for the story to end here, but it doesn't. Instead, what happens is we have to go for a little trip. So we're going to go hiking up this aggregate demand curve. We're going to keep hiking up until we get to this point right here, where aggregate demand and aggregate supply intersect. So there's an increase in the price level. Right? Why is there an increase in the price level? Well, aggregate supply is vertical. Aggregate supply is independent of prices. If you do anything to change prices, aggregate supply is not going to move. You're not going to get any more output regardless of what the price level is. So under the real business cycle model, with a vertical aggregate supply curve, you will not have any change in output in response to an aggregate demand shock. Why is that? Well, under the real business cycle model, what we're assuming is that, well, basically the economy responds to real shocks, it does not respond to nominal shocks. It responds to supply side shocks and not demand side shocks. Demand side shocks are nominal shocks. They're shocks to nominal variables. Right? So, this is our current equilibrium point in the supply and demand price output space, right here. We wanted it to be here, but it's not, it's here. So then what we do is we just trace this little blue dotted line up. We keep tracing it up. Okay, but where do we go? Well, we keep tracing it up to that new IS curve. Like that. Right, because IS and LM need to be intersecting directly above where aggregate demand and aggregate supply intersect. So if it's here, it is just literally a straight line above where AD and AS intersect. But if we're here, all right, I'm just going to go ahead and draw this dotted line over. Call it RT2. Right, so the real interest rate goes up once more. But if you look here, there's no equilibrium right here, right? Because the LM curve is nowhere near where it needs to be in order to intersect with this new blue IS curve. So what happens? Well, remember the price level increased. If the price level goes up, the LM curve shifts in. How much does that LM curve shift in? Well, the LM curve shifts in by exactly enough to ensure that this new real interest rate, this new equilibrium real interest rate, is right here, directly above, so it intersects at a point that is directly above the intersection of the new aggregate demand and original aggregate supply curve. So we wanted YTH, but really what we get is YT star, which was this right here. So because the aggregate supply curve is vertical, right, there's no relationship between output and prices in this model. Because of that, we have ourselves a little bit of a problem if we want to use government spending to try to stimulate any economic activity, because we're not going to be able to do it. There will be no real responses. The only real response that we will see is an increase in the real interest rate. So yes, real variables, well, a real variable does in fact respond to a government spending shock, but it's the real interest rate that goes up. Why is that? Well, the crowding out effect, right? Firms can't invest as much anymore. That's not very good. So another way that we can think about this, just for a second, if we want to look at the relationship between output and prices in this model in response to a demand shock, let's think about if we put this thing with GDP in percent changes. Like this. Right, so all I did was just take GDP, and now it's in terms of percentage changes. Right, so it's just the new minus old over old. Well, if we're assuming, as this model does, output can't respond to demand side nominal shocks, that tells me the percent change in output is equal to 0. So I just plug in a 0 here. I'll make that 0 look a little bit nicer. Marginally nicer. I plug in a 0 for that. Okay, well, this isn't looking good. Let's solve this for a government spending shock. I want to solve that for a government spending shock. I just get government spending on one side of the equation and these two on the other. So I just subtract CT, or percent change in C, plus percent change in I. Like this. I've got them in parentheses just because reasons. So I got this negative out here. If I wanted to distribute that negative through, what I would get is, well, these parentheses would drop, and this positive would become a negative. So negative CT minus, or negative percent change in CT minus percent change in IT. So that tells me, because output can't change, if this guy were to go up, some combination of consumption and investment would have to drop. So which one is going to drop more? Well, there's a little bit of theory that addresses this in something called consumption smoothing. You've seen a little bit of it. Might not have seen it explicitly. Agents smooth consumption over time. All right. Actually, I believe we talked about this when we were looking at stuff with the indifference curve analysis, right, with the dynamic macro stuff. When we were doing that, So when we were doing that, what we had was in this indifference curve analysis, right, we saw that, let's say, income increased in one period but not in the next. Well, consumption would go up, but it would go up by like kind of an amount in between, which indicates agents smooth out their consumption over time. So there's going to be a bit of a change in consumption in response to government spending, right? But there's not going to be that much of a change in consumption. So there's going to be more of a change in investment. Investment's going to respond more than consumption does. Meaning that investment is more volatile than consumption is. With that change in interest rates as a response to government spending, investment is going to fall by quite a bit. One, because investment is being crowded out, right? Because investment, when firms invest, they're borrowing. Right? They're borrowing funds in order to be able to expand their business. If the amount of funds that are available falls, well, the price of borrowing is going to increase, the interest rate goes up, firms can't borrow as much. So they get crowded out. But in addition to that, because agents are smoothing their consumption over time, when there's a response, or in this response to government spending, changes in government spending, right, what we get is that there won't be that much of a change to consumption, but there's going to be a much larger change to investment. And of those three components, C, I, and G, investment is by far the most volatile component. I believe there is some stuff in the book talking about that. If there is not, I'll be happy to post some other readings that will explain or really show how volatile investment is compared to consumption. So because investment's more volatile, that will respond more. So if there's less investment, right, there's going to be less economic growth, we can say. And basically the negative of the sum of consumption and investment will be equal to the increase in government spending. So for any amount that government spending increases, the sum of consumption and investment has to fall by that exact same amount. Government spending goes up by $100, the sum of consumption and investment has to fall by $100. And if government spending increases by $100, it's very likely that consumption would fall by about $10 and investment falls by about $90. So let's just go ahead and wrap this up really quick. let's just go ahead and summarize what happens here. Right here, there's a shock to government spending, GT. So I'll say, like, the source of the shock is government spending going up. All right, well, what happens to some of these endogenous variables? Well, let's see, what did we have before? I believe we had, I'm going to do it in the same order as what we had earlier. All right, so we've got these 5 endogenous variables: wages, labor, output, prices, and the real interest rate. Well, I'm just going to have actually I'll put a flat line over these guys indicating there's no change. There's no change to labor, there's no change to wages, there's no change to output. Price level increases, and the real interest rate increases. Prices go up, interest rates go up. All right, now if we wanted to compare this to the previous 2 shocks that we had, technology shock was the first. All right, well, with the technology shock, labor increased, wages increased, output increased, prices fell, real interest rate fell. And then if we want to look at the labor supply shock, where there's an increase in HT, right? Labor increased, wages fell, output increased, prices fell, real interest rate fell. Now we can already tell that there's a difference here, right? We can look at we went through this in the previous video and saw the difference. It was like, okay, well, this difference in the wage rate, qualitatively speaking, is different than what we saw here, right? The wage rate increase under a technology shock, it decreases under a labor supply shock. Let's look at government spending. Okay, is the change, or is the response of labor here different than what it is here and here? The answer to that would be yes, so it gets a little check mark. No, little Twitter blue check mark. Wages. Is it different than either of these? Yes, it is. Output, is it different? Yep. Prices. Well, it's different, actually, than both of them. Yeah. Prices increase here and they decrease in the other 2 models. Or the other 2 shocks, I mean, not models. Real interest rate, is that different? The answer is yes. So, what I can say with certainty here what I can say with certainty is that we can uniquely identify government spending, technology, and labor supply shocks. We can identify the difference between those 3. Right? Each of those 3 yields a unique response relative to the others. So when I'm talking about uniquely identifying the responses to these shocks, I'm not saying, okay, well, labor goes up in both the technology and the labor supply shocks, so we can't tell a difference there. Well, in that particular variable, yes, we can. But if we look at the combinations of all of these in responses to the shocks, so look across the rows, not the columns. If you look across the rows in responses to these shocks, what you will see is that, in fact, those combinations are different. As long as there's at least one difference between any of them, then we can uniquely identify them. So far, we can uniquely identify government spending, technology, and labor supply shocks. And with that, we will terminate this video, and there will be one more video that looks at responses to monetary policy shocks. This is a money and banking course. It's probably the one that we're going to be more interested in, right? I would assume so. So we'll be looking at a response to a monetary policy shock, lastly, and then there will be an exam, and then after that we'll be looking at a model that allows for monetary policy to interact a little bit more with the economy. So that will wrap things up for right now. There's one more video to come. It'll be about another 20-25 minute long lecture, and that'll be that. So until then, enjoy.